kind of the last slide we were on, so let me just go through that, and that should catch everybody up. Anybody not here last week? Oh, you weren't here last week? Okay. You know, I can never remember what I preached the week before. I can't do it. I don't know. Okay, well, if you remember, Nehemiah was very upset. Time came to serve the king, and the king noticed that he looked very unhappy, and the king asked him, what's wrong? And, you don't want to be unhappy looking in front of the king. That could land you in jail, or it could land you into the guillotine or something. Because if you're depressed and you make the king depressed, now that's not cool, right? So Nehemiah explained everything to him. And again, it was normally very important that regardless of one's personal problems, that they maintained a cheerful disposition while in the king's presence. In other words, if you're depressed, don't make the king depressed. Remember that Nehemiah had been fasting, and that, along with the inward grief, obviously took a physical toll on him. I mean, that doesn't mean he was fasting for the whole 4 months, but yeah, that's going to take an effect on you when you're unhappy and not eating. So when the king asked Nehemiah what was wrong, Nehemiah was naturally afraid, and especially when he tells King Artaxerxes the truth. Can't lie to the king. Finds out you're lying, now you're in bigger trouble than you were before, right? And the subject of Israel would have been contentious at best, and Nehemiah's request would have been great indeed. Nehemiah began with the standard form of addressing the king by saying, "May the king live forever." That was the standard thing that you would say. And notice that he didn't mention Jerusalem by name. Rather, he elicited the king's sympathy by emphasizing the desecration of his ancestral tombs. King asked Nehemiah what he wanted, and Nehemiah then made a brief prayer under his breath. And that's very characteristic. I mean, at least 8 times I counted that Nehemiah just kind of stops and prays every time there's something crucial going on. And you know what? Every time Jesus did something very crucial, we see him going off to pray first. So very good habit to have. I turned to the king and said, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight," and then of course he asks him what he wants. And this was also the acceptable way of asking the king for something. So that's what we saw last week. Now there are several theories why Nehemiah may have waited 4 months before serving and speaking with the king. One possibility is that perhaps it was because the king was staying in his winter palace in Babylon and had just returned. And to me that makes a lot of sense, okay? Perhaps he was just waiting for the king to be in a good mood. Either way, Nehemiah was a man of prayer, and God used this time to prepare Nehemiah's heart and the heart of the king. There are also several theories as to why King Artaxerxes held some partiality for Nehemiah. In the book of Esther, King Xerxes was having a banquet with various governors and princes of the empire because he was campaigning for war. If you remember Esther, some of you do, yeah. In the king's drunken stupor, the Magi urged him to motivate the leaders by having the eunuchs summon Queen Vashti to come and pose for them, probably nude. And that's something that was done in the old days, and really it's something kind of still done today, when you see, World War I, World War II, pinup posters, right? Motivating the men. Men, look at what you're fighting for, and so it was to rally the troops and get everybody cheering and happy and, so it's very likely what happened. It doesn't say that specifically. So some scholars believe that one possible reason Queen Vashti refused was because she was pregnant with the king's son, Artaxerxes. Other scholars have suggested that Esther, a Jewess, was Artaxerxes' real mother. Either way, Esther, as the mother or stepmother, Either way, so she probably raised him, and it's likely that Mordecai also played a role in his upbringing. So maybe there was some compassion there for the Jewish people because of that. You have to go to a book called Esther. No, there's not. There's not. It's assumed. It's assumed by scholars. And I'll later on, if we get that far, I'll put up a little timeline. But it looks, within the timeline, it looks correct. Right, yeah, you weren't just supposed to come, were you? And if you came there and he held out his scepter, then you, touched it or something? Or if he holds his scepter out to you, that means you're allowed. But if he doesn't hold the scepter out to you, you're cooked. So why would it have taken Nehemiah and his escorts, now this is what we're going to get into more today, but why would it have taken them 3 to 4 months to reach Jerusalem from Persia? Yes. Yeah, I think that is certainly a big part of it, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Anybody, any other ideas? Yes. Right, they did have to circumvent other areas. That's exactly right, but they had to do it for a reason. And I mentioned this way back when we went through Genesis. It's like so important. It may not seem important, but in studying the Bible, it's unbelievably important that you realize this, okay? Basically, Persia is over here, and Israel's over here. And so if they would have went directly across, they would be crossing the desert, the Arabian desert. And when you have soldiers and cavalry and, hauling stuff, like you said, there's no way you can cross the desert. No way. And so I don't care if you go back to Abraham's time or Jacob's time or throughout all Scripture, whenever they travel back and forth, they had to travel around. And y'all remember what that's called? That's called the Fertile Crescent. Or if we want to be French, we call it croissant. I don't know if that's correct or not, but anyway, yeah, that's the Fertile Crescent. See how there's water? And that means this is all going to be green. This is all going to be vegetation for the animals that they got. Water to water the horses. They would not have been on camels. The Magi did not come across on camels. They came. It took them a long time. They had to do the Fertile Crescent. They were on horseback, right? Persians. Remember, these were soldiers. Okay, the Persians were almost always using horses. They were not very rarely using camels. And then, even if you had a camel, you still got to know where some of the watering holes are, don't you? Yeah, I mean, you got to really. I mean, you can go take the shortcut and die. So they had to travel the Fertile Crescent, and that is a key topographical feature in so many books of the Bible. Okay. So to understand Scripture, remember that word, Fertile Crescent, or croissant, if you prefer. Okay, verse 6. Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadels by the temple and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. So let's take a look at that. In verse 6, 45:9. It literally translates to royal wives. A Greek historian by the name of, what's that name, Trelane? Can you? That's a hard one. I like to give them hard names to say. Probably Tessius Maspia, and that the king had at least 3 concubines. Persian queens like Esther seemed to be influential in the court, but this instance of the queen's presence seems unusual because Persian kings normally dined alone. So that's why Nehemiah was there, right? He's serving the food, he's serving the drink. Very unusual for the queen to be there. Perhaps Demespia liked Nehemiah, and so she was present to promote his request. So a lot we don't know there, but that's presumption on our part. The king asked, "How long will your journey take, and when will you return?" Once Nehemiah had arrived officially in Jerusalem, he acquired the building materials. It seems like he acquired them afterwards, but it's not for sure. And it took 52 days to build the wall. Therefore, Nehemiah may have returned at that point and then went back to Judea with a more ample commission. However, based on chapter 5, verse 14, it seems that Nehemiah spent 12 years in his first term as governor of Judah. Then in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, Nehemiah returned to report to the king, and then he returned to Judah for his second term in chapter 13. So he probably went back and forth multiple times. And the fact that Artaxerxes granted Nehemiah's request and that he inquired how long it would take him to return implies that the king must have had some fondness for him. You know? Unless you're just so happy for the guy to be gone, you give him whatever he wants, right? That could be the case. But no, I think he really liked him. And he didn't want his attendant to be gone long, longer than what was necessary, someone that he could trust. So, but I'll tell you what, if he was a guy that I could trust, I would want to put him in that powerful position to take care of my interests. If it makes sense. Okay, well, this is like a little timeline. I had a different one up, but I didn't like it, so I changed it. So I'm not used to this one right here. But here we can see the fall of Jerusalem, from Babylon. This is where Daniel is taken, right? And then really, 70 years go by. We have the Medo-Persian Empire taking over. The kings usually had, in this case, they had 2 names. Just like in the New Testament, most of the people in the New Testament, if they were Jewish, had a Hebrew name and they had a Greek name. In this case, they had a Persian name and a Median name because they were the Medo-Persian Empire, right? And we see where Zerubbabel built the temple, and it took him this long to complete the temple. Then it's not till we get down here do we see Esther, okay? And then We see Ezra's group coming, the second group now over here. And then, of course, Nehemiah. But it is very likely, again, within that timeline of those years right here, that Esther could have been the mother, the stepmother, raised him, something, okay? So, possible. Well, these go by fives, right? So, yeah. So, if you want to sit there and count them all, but yeah. But obviously, Daniel was an old man. He never left Babylon, So these are like 70 years, and then the Medo-Persians took over. And if you think about it, not hardly long after Nehemiah, look what we got down here is Malachi, last book of the Bible. And then we have the 400 years of silence known as the intertestamental period, right? Where God did not speak for 400 years until Jesus came. So, you can see very close to that. No, I don't think he spoke, or God would have preserved his word, right? That's why people were dying. They were eager for God to speak again. They were caught up in all these false religions. They were even caught up in what became legalism, like crazy with Judaism, right? And, this animal sacrificing. When you sacrifice an animal because you've sinned, for most people it's very traumatic. But when you start sacrificing animals one after the other all the time, you get used to that stuff, It was no longer a sweet aroma to the nostrils of God anymore. It became just a easy way to sin, Just go ahead and sin and slaughter the animals, And people were hurting badly for something new. They were desperate to look for something to get them out of this rut. And then all of a sudden, who comes? Jesus. I mean, perfect timing. The Greco-Roman Empire had come in now. It was short-lived, the Greco-Roman Empire, but took over the Medo-Persian Empire faster than any other empire previously. And by the time Jesus gets there, everybody speaks Greek, the same language. They had all these Roman roads to travel through and do commerce. The Romans were very strict, with the law themselves, and so there was peace. Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, I mean, everything fit together perfectly for the coming of the Christ. He could not have come earlier. He couldn't have come later. He came at that special time. And I think that's why, specifically, God did not speak for those 400 years. Now, Nehemiah requested the king grant him letters for safe conduct beyond the river, and beyond the river, that would be then the Trans-Euphrates. Just like if you're in Israel and you say Trans-Jordan, that means beyond the Jordan. And the Persian Empire at this time was vast, extending from India to the Mediterranean. And they were already into Europe. They were everywhere, right? And all the way to India. And the Euphrates River was the natural dividing line between East and West. Every region between Persia and Israel was controlled by a governor, which was also an official or officer of the Persian court. These letters not only protected Nehemiah, but he also would have been provided with food and drink on the stages of his journey. So whenever he stopped off, these governors, they had to feed everybody, right? How'd you like to have all them stopping by one night? There's nothing much in the fridge, but. And he also asked to be granted a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. Now, the word forest in Hebrew is the word pards, which is another loan word from Old Persian meaning a pleasant, enclosed retreat, and it's where we get our English word park. This word only appears in the Old Testament here and in Ecclesiastes 2:5 as parks and as parks, and in the Song of Solomon 4:13 as the word orchard. In the Septuagint, it transliterates to paradosis, which is where we get our word paradise. Nevertheless, the king's force may have been in Lebanon, okay? So maybe they did get the stuff from Lebanon and hauled it over there. Of course, they're famous for their cedars. However, it's most likely that they got the wood from Solomon's gardens at Etham, which was about 6 miles from South Jerusalem. It stands to reason that the costly imported Lebanese cedar would not be used for a citadel gate, but rather for their indigenous oak or poplar or terebinth. How many know what terebinth is? No, I don't either. Some kind of wood, okay? Yeah, I knew poplar, but terebinth I didn't know. The citadel palace probably refers to the fortress at the north corner of the temple and was the forerunner of the Antonia fortress built by Herod the Great. In contrast to Ezra, Nehemiah, as the newly appointed governor of Judah, had army officers and cavalry officially escort him to his destination. So I think he's got a lot more money with him than Ezra had. And seems like the king maybe likes Nehemiah a lot more. So he's taking care of Nehemiah. Beware of those trying to hijack your vision. Sanballat and Tobias were influential local politicians, yet theoretically they couldn't hurt Nehemiah. If they hurt Nehemiah, boy, then they had the wrath of the king on them, right? They viewed Nehemiah as competition and as a threat. Now, Sanballat, some pronounce that Sanballat, literally translates to sin has given life. Can you imagine a name like that? Sin has given life. It is a Babylonian name, which is the name of their moon god. And you know what's really fascinating too? To the Muslim, Allah is actually, he's the moon god as well. His family governed Samaria, and he had managed to marry into the family of the high priest. Tobias' name means the Lord is good. He was an official in Ammon, which is a small country east of Judah. He had ties and influence with the top Jewish families. There is some evidence that these men had Jewish backgrounds, though they preferred their political status and diluted their Jewish ancestry. So if they were Jewish, they kind of played that down because it was not politically savvy to be Jewish. So, yes. That has already actually happened. Because of the diaspora, remember the Jews got spread out, and a lot of these Jews intermarried pagans, okay? And so really the Samaritans, the reason why the Jews hate the Samaritans is because they're considered as Jewish half-breeds. They were the ones that were not willing to get divorced, when they were supposed to get divorced, or, they decided to, keep it together. They had their own temple. They had their own copy of the Torah. They kept their religion very Jewish in some ways, but then they amalgamated a lot of paganism into it. And so that was considered a blasphemy to the Jew. And so that's why they hated Samaritans so much. Wasn't that long ago a copy of the Samaritan, I'm going to say the Samaritan Pentateuch or the Samaritan Torah was discovered. And it really helped solidify what we know because it was such an old copy, I think they believed in the first 5 books of Moses, but they also, they were the ones that worshiped the pigs. Remember when Jesus was going to cast the demon out of the demoniac, and the demoniac begged, for them to go into the pigs. And so Jesus granted him permission, and then when they went to the pigs went nuts and ran over the cliff. And I was by the cliff, by the way. And I mean, it goes straight down right to where the water is. There's no shore, really. There's nothing there. It just goes right down. And, when the people came, instead of being happy that this nut was finally in his right mind and not going to, bother people anymore, and he was going in their tombs and, necromancing with the bodies and doing all kinds of stuff like that, and the people were very upset. But here's the guy now clothed and in his right mind, and the people were mad at Jesus because the devil will mess up your thinking. And the reason why is because those pigs were key to their economy. The pig to them is equivalent to the lamb or the sheep would be to a Jew. So, you'd sacrifice the lamb on the altar. Well, they're going to sacrifice the pig on the altar, So, yeah, that whole area. Yeah, that whole area. Sanballat the Horonite probably means that he came from Horonim, which was a town in Moab. Tobiah the Ammonite, again, he was an official, but that word also translates to servant. And some believe that maybe he was a freed slave at one time and he got up in position somehow. He acquired a position of dignity. They were districts under the satrap of Syria and leaders of the Samaritan faction. They were very disturbed, probably, again, for political reasons, not religious reasons, because they believed that their power and control was being threatened. So they made up their mind right then and there that they're going to give Nehemiah a hard time. So Nehemiah inspects the walls. Nehemiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up to the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. So the Bible chronology, I just thought I would kind of interject this one more time. The Bible chronology may not always line up with the secular accounts. Okay, if you look at the Jewish historian Josephus, or again, if you look at the Elephantine Papyrus, the chronology doesn't always line up. Therefore, it's good to point out that many of the names in the genealogies were very common during that period, and so you're going to see repetition. A lot of people had the same names. Another point is that the Bible doesn't necessarily distinguish between Artaxerxes I and Artaxerxes II. So again, there's a little fudging right there. Nehemiah's journey took time to prepare. All in all, it took him 3 to 4 months to get from Persia to Jerusalem. In verse 11, our text implies that Nehemiah took 3 days to get acquainted and settled in. Interestingly, Ezra also took 3 days to get settled in when he came to Jerusalem. So it kind of goes back to what I call the 3-day theology. Y'all know what that is? Where lots of key things happened in 3-day increments. Whether it was Esther and the Jews fasting and praying for 3 days, or Jesus in the tomb for 3 days, or so many instances of 3 days. There's always a lot of threes. He hired some men to accompany him as he cautiously and discreetly inspected the city's fortifications at night. Nehemiah probably rode a mule or donkey as the other men walked. Now, he needed the men for protection and to answer his questions, but he did not want to draw attention to himself. So, if they would have been on horses, that would have been suspicious, because usually only soldiers ride horses. So he was on the donkey, the others were walking along. It's dark. Nehemiah did not make a complete circuit around the wall because Jerusalem had always been attacked from the north, because that side was the most vulnerable. He knew that the walls there would be completely destroyed, so there was really no point to inspect that area. So some of the geographic highlights include, we have the Valley Gate. That's what it would look like today. According to 2 Chronicles 26:9, King Uzziah fortified the towers in the west wall, which overlooked the central valley between the Hinnom and Kidron Valley. It was here that Nehemiah began his inspection, and then he backtracked and ended his inspection from the same point. So you could almost call that Nehemiah's gate, couldn't you? Because that's where he went out of, and that's where he came in through. Excavations in 1927 and 28 uncovered the remains of a gate from the Persian period, which has been identified as the Valley Gate. So, kind of cool. The Jackal Well, or the Serpent Well. Now, this particular location during Nehemiah's time is generally unknown. There's some conjecture, a couple different places of where it's at. Some interpreters have suggested this was Ain Rogel, a well that was situated at the junction of the Hinnom and Kidron valleys. Others have suggested that this was the pool of Siloam, which I don't think that is, because now where they thought the pool of Siloam was, they pretty much established that that's where it is. So, again, there's still, hey, this stuff has been destroyed for thousands and thousands of years, and when everything was destroyed, how did they rebuild it? You ever wonder? They built on top of it. Yeah, they brought dirt in, they covered it up, and that's why as the thousands of years went by, the cities kept getting higher and higher, right? Yeah, it's kind of cool when you go to Israel, because you can be on the main street and then look down where they've excavated, and see the old city underneath. It's kind of cool. And that's also known in that part of the world as a tell. So when you hear about archaeologists investigating Tel Jerome or whatever, okay, the tell is a hill, and that was a city underneath that hill at one time. It was buried and covered. And why would they keep putting cities in the same spot? The city's destroyed. Why don't we just build a new city over there? Why would you want to build it on that same spot? Yep. Exactly. These were crossroad communities, and so they were key roads, right? Commerce, people traveling, whatever, and then there must have been a water source. So again, they had to put the city there, and so they would just cover it up with dirt and keep building. Now we have the Dung or Refuse Gate. Was most likely the gate which led to the garbage dump about 500 yards away. This also included an open common sewer which ran into the Kidron Brook and ultimately into the Hinnom Valley. This valley was symbolic of hell because the refuse was burned and was continually day and night smoldering. So when you see references to Gehenna, That's where they say where the bad people end up in the garbage dump, right? And if you can stand the smell and the flies, they've got some not good ice cream over here and falafels. Looks kind of, but anyway. Then there's the Fountain Gate. Was probably located on the east side of the southern end of the city. In other words, southeast facing toward En Rogal. And this would have been the King's Pool, also known as the Pool of Shiloh. Some scholars believe that this is the Pool of Shiloh or an adjacent pool or spring called Birket el Hamra. In the New Testament, this is where Jesus had healed the man who was near death and couldn't get into the pool. Remember that? It's kind of interesting about that pool because the implication was that it was a pool, but the water would be really low. And every once in a while, it would start filling. And when it filled, it would stir. And that the red clay in the pool made the water then look like blood. It would look red like blood, extremely high mineral content. And when that water came up and began swirling, that's when you had to jump in. It had therapeutic properties. And so as soon as you saw that water go, you had to get in there really quick. And if you remember, this guy was laying there, couldn't even move. Nobody would help him. They were just thinking about themselves. They didn't think about helping this old guy or, anything. And then Jesus took care of it, right? I remember being there, and I can't remember the name of the gate, though. But we went in through the gate, and almost immediately on our right was the Church of St. Helena. And y'all remember what I told you the significance of St. Helena is? St. Helena is supposed to be the name of Mary's mother. So if you venerate Mary, well, then you got to venerate her mother. And if you venerate her mother, then you got to venerate her mother, and you kind of open a can of worms up. Nick? Well, no, it doesn't. Here's what happened. After Jesus, the thing didn't work anymore. And so what happened is when the church came in, this would have been the Catholic Church, and of course they built that church. They built churches on every holy site that's mentioned in Scripture, okay? So you have to go through the church and basically out the back, Beautiful, beautiful facility. One of our ladies sang there, for us. But you go out the back, and you got to realize you're way up here looking down. Okay? And so this is like the steps, the portico that they had built for people to sit there and wait for that water to come up. Okay? So that poor old guy was laying somewhere in one of these steps, okay? And when you look down in there, because that pool dried up, they were frantic to find it. So they started digging. But nothing happened. So they started digging over here, and they started digging over here. Next thing you know, you have all these little pools all over down in that basin. And which one was the original one, who knows? Okay? But it's funny, as soon as Jesus was gone, that thing stopped working. And somehow this is connected with this. And that, I believe, is Hezekiah's tunnel that was used to bring water into the city. So, yeah. It is interesting, isn't it? But I'd like to jump in that water, man. This is a map. That's probably pretty much all we're going to cover today. But this is just kind of a map of the walls back then, or what were the walls, should have been the walls, whatever. And you can see some of the different gates, around it. Yeah, what they did, and this was common in a lot of cities, they had double walls. And so what they would do is they would actually build on top of the wall, and then they would build like porches coming off the walls. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff on those walls. So when the walls come down, boy, a lot of junk comes down with it, you know. And of course, they were not supposed to bury the dead within the city. So the dead were always buried on the outside. The problem is, as time went on, the city got bigger. And so they had to extend the walls out, and over the hundreds and thousands of, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of years, whatever. Now the cemetery is in the city, and it's surrounded by a cemetery, the whole Jerusalem. And that's why it's called the City of the Dead. Yeah, neat. Uh, that's a good idea. That makes sense. That makes sense. Everett said when they expanded that wall down there, they just left that piece of wall, and Rose said it was to block the smell. So yeah, that's a good answer too. So, yeah. Yeah, because if you go to the Old Testament, one of the prophecies of Jesus is that his tomb would be inside of the city. And for hundreds of years, scholars said that can't be because no one's allowed to be buried inside the city. But then when they extended the walls out, it became inside the city. This is a different one, and it doesn't have that wall. I noticed here they show the Temple Mount really big, and then on the other one, they show the area. It looks a lot different, or looks smaller. So, it would have been some homes, businesses, sure, yeah, everything. And they had fresh water going in, and they, as you know, had the sewer running out. And what was I going to say? I'm just pulling this out of my head right now because I have not checked it out, but maybe somebody wants to do it as a homework assignment. You ever wonder why the 12 gates are not named after the 12 tribes of Israel? They were named for function. That's a good one. That's a good answer. Yeah. They were named for function, but if you remember, this is based off the tabernacle. And if you remember, the tribes were encamped around the tabernacle. So shouldn't the gates be named after the 12 tribes? Well, I'll give you a little answer. This is just out of my head now, but I haven't looked it up yet. If you remember, every tribe of Israel had also an animal representing them. Like Judah was the lion, right? And there is a lion's, isn't there a lion's gate? Sheep gate, fish gate, old gate, valley gate, dung gate, fountain gate, water gate. I was going to put a picture of Nixon up there, but we didn't really do the water gate today. The east gate, the inspection gate, the gate of Ephraim, and the prison gate. Wasn't there a jackal gate? Didn't we read that earlier? But it's also called the snake gate. And well, Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, is represented by the wolf. The tribe of Dan maybe was the snake. So if somebody that would be a good study to look up. So, Okay. So Israel and Jerusalem historically were always attacked from the north. So in the case of Israel, nothing good ever from the north. Okay? Never. Theoretically, the Magog invasion will come from theoretically. I think if you go directly north, it runs right into Moscow, directly north. The north section, or St. Petersburg. Well, either way, see, Petersburg used to be the capital, and it's Moscow. The northern sections of the wall were probably obliterated, so again, there was no point in inspecting those walls. Interestingly, archaeological digs from back in the 20s and even to the 1990s have confirmed the location of most of these landmarks. Verse 14, Nehemiah and his donkey didn't have enough room to get through the rubble, probably because the supporting terraces along the walls created additional rubble. So yeah, when those houses came down, buildings came down on top of the walls, and then the ones adjacent to the walls, and left a big mess. Again, probably because the collapse of the supporting did I just read that? Did I double up on that? Oh, well, whatever. Okay. So that's where we're going to stop.